On behalf of Fife Council Libraries, I'd like to welcome you to St Andrew's Library this evening. It's fantastic to see such a brilliant turnout. Very pleased to see you all here tonight, and I hope you have a fantastic evening.
Well, that depends. We have to see that, you know.
We'll wait and see.
You wait and see, yeah.
I'm very pleased to introduce Geoff Holder this evening. Geoff is described on his website as a Welshman with an English accent living in Scotland with a French wife. Doesn't say whose wife he's living with, but I'm presuming that it's his own. So very multinational. Geoff is the author of over 25 non-fiction books on the paranormal, folklore, local history, all sorts of gruesome things, and we're very pleased to have him with us this evening, where he's going to be talking a bit about St Andrews. Geoff's book, Haunted St Andrews, is coming out later this year, and we're delighted to be getting a bit of a preview of that, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what he's got to tell us. Thank you very much, Geoff.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much indeed for coming along. Just wanted to check that the technology works. It does. Hurrah. Now, these days, as Jennifer mentioned, I'm a full-time writer, but once upon a time I used to have a proper job. And when I was working there one day, someone phoned me up at the office and to book me for a talk like this. And as sometimes happens, I'm sure it's happened to you, he didn't know me, so he forgot my name. So when the person on the reception answered the phone and said, "Hello, can I help you?" He said, "Oh yeah, can I speak to the ghouls and goblins guy?" And she said, "Oh, that'll be Geoff then," put me through. So I think of myself as the ghouls and goblins guy. That's how I come to you tonight. Before I kick off, just a question to you all. Has anyone seen me speak before? No? Well, one of you has, but you're in my social circle, so you don't count. Okay. The fact that you haven't is great. It means I can reuse all my old jokes. That's brilliant. There's less effort on my part. These are some of the books that I've written. As Jennifer mentioned, I specialise in writing books about the paranormal, the supernatural, the peculiar, the weird, the strange, the gruesome. I spend my days researching demonology and witchcraft and hauntings and stone circles and mysteries and all sorts of wonderful things like that. Haunted Dundee is a parallel to Haunted St Andrews, came out a few weeks ago, and tonight I'm going to be extracting elements from Haunted St Andrews, which will be published in May. We're going to be talking about apparitions, that is to say visible ghosts, about poltergeists, which is German for noisy ghosts, ghosts that move things around and cause disruption. And we're going to be mentioning a few sort of truly bizarre supernatural experiences that we can possibly regard as omens of death, doppelgangers, and even a vortex of evil. All to come. But first, I just want to ask you just a few questions and get to know you a bit more. I'm going to ask you 4 questions. They're not mutually exclusive, so you can answer yes to more than one. How many people here believe in ghosts?
Okay.
Okay. How many people here do not believe in ghosts? Smaller number. How many people don't know whether they believe in ghosts or not? Substantial number. Okay. How many people here think that asking, "Do you believe in ghosts?" is actually a trick question? Yes. Yeah. See, St Andrews is always a smart aleck, and I believe it is a trick question, and I'll tell you why. As far as I'm concerned, belief or non-belief in ghosts is an irrelevance. It's a digression. As far as I'm concerned, ghosts are either real or they're not real. Belief doesn't play any part in that. At this moment, we're all surrounded by a strange, mysterious force that few of us understand. It's called electricity. But I don't need to believe in electricity. I don't need to disbelieve in electricity. My belief and disbelief is irrelevant. And I think that should apply to the idea of ghosts as well. If ghosts are real, if ghosts are not real, then they belong in the realm of psychology and sociology and folklore and neuroscience, and it's worth investigating that and worth understanding that, because it'll teach us something about ourselves and the fact that we're all possessors of the most bizarre object in the universe, which is the human brain, which is definitely the least understood object in the universe. perhaps ghosts are real, and possibly they are some kind of environmental recording, like a kind of environmental DVD player or TiVo, and if we could just work out how to operate the remote control, we'd be able to access those recordings. So they're part of our physical universe, they're not supernatural. Or perhaps ghosts are real in the traditional sense, the way people think of them as being discarnate intelligences that can communicate with us and are aware of us and we can be aware of them. And if so, and if those are real, then if we can prove that, then what we'd be looking at is basically a scientific revolution, a paradigm shift in the way we understand how the universe works. So all of those possibilities are definitely worth studying and worth investigating, but they're all worth thinking about, and I think that's more important. It's worth thinking about ghosts rather than believing or disbelieving in ghosts. So that's the heavyweight lecture part of it over. So if we can now, let me take you by the hand and lead you through the streets of St Andrews. I'll show you something that can make you change your mind. We're going to start with the cathedral, or specifically the White Lady and the Mummies of the Haunted Tower. It's a good title, huh? This is the Haunted Tower. That's the St Will's Tower in the background. More specifically, to get your bearings, this is the shattered east gable of the cathedral. This is the Haunted Tower here. It is the only rectangular tower in the precinct wall of the cathedral. Here's another view of it. There are two stories connected with the Haunted Tower. The White Lady, the apparition, and the mummies of the Haunted Tower. And they have existed in parallel for a while, and over time they've become intertwined. And I've tried to unpick this very rich and complex tapestry. The White Lady, who is described typically as a woman in a long flowing white dress, although sometimes the colour varies, has been claimed to have been seen periodically since perhaps the 1820s or the 1830s. It's the earliest account that I can see where a group of children going past the cathedral as it was getting dark saw the White Lady walking along the wall here where the parapet used to run. And that was multiple witnesses, but the account isn't very reliable. We then have several other sightings of the White Lady through the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. In total, for the 19th century, no more than about half a dozen. In one case, a group of fishermen who were going past the cathedral wall saw her inside the graveyard here. They thought she'd been trapped inside because it was locked at the time. They were disabused of this notion when she walked through a wall, and one of them fainted. And in another example, we have a brother and sister walking in the graveyard at twilight, and they both saw a figure in a long flowing white dress wearing a veil. As far as I can tell, the White Lady is then not seen for the first part of the 20th century. She may have been done so, but I haven't been able to find any reports of her. In 1968, two students both together saw the White Lady, and they reported that to the Citizen. One of the students had seen the White Lady on 3 previous occasions over the past 2 years. There's another sighting, maybe a second sighting from the 1970s. Once again, we have 2 people, this time in broad daylight, wandering around the cathedral graveyard. They see a woman in a long white dress. She's wearing a veil. The husband turns to the wife and says, "You don't see that kind of thing much these days, do you?" And at which point the White Lady vanishes. Since the 1970s, I've not been able to trace any other reports of this particular ghost. We shall return to the White Lady in a moment. Some of the accounts describe her as a full face. Some of them say that she is veiled, which may link her with another or possibly the same apparition known as the Veiled Nun, who is said to walk along here. This is the Nun's Walk from the Pens leading into St Leonard's School. It's actually named after the ghost. The veiled apparition who is seen in this area has a legend attached to her. It's a very gruesome Gothic legend in which if she lifts her veil, she will reveal her hideously scarred face, and that will drive the person who sees her insane. That's a creative invention that's been tacked on to the apparitions, in my opinion, because it's a story that's borrowed from elsewhere, from European folklore elsewhere. But the notion that we have a veiled female figure in this area has been reported more than once. We also have a female figure in antique costume reported from the 1920s in the Pens, although in this case the dress was reported as red or purple or something like that, and she wasn't wearing a veil. And I'm intrigued by all of this because it seems to me what we have is a cluster of female apparitions. The White Lady is traditionally reported around the cathedral and around the edge of the cathedral wall and that area there. The Pens are here, and that's where the woman in red dress was reported in the 1920s. The Nun's Walk is here, and then down here in the harbour in 1942, a grey lady was reported by several fishermen, and she was different to the other apparitions. She was standing, looking out to sea with her hands around her mouth as if she was calling, and she was interpreted by the fishermen as calling back the corpse of a fisherman who died in a recent accident at sea, and indeed the following day his body was washed up on the shore. So I wonder whether the grey lady down here, the veiled nun down here, the red lady here and the white lady here are actually all manifestations of avatars of the same phenomenon, or whether they're not connected at all. Honestly, I have no idea whatsoever. But I find that intriguing. Going back to the haunted tower and the mummies of the haunted tower. I love mummies. I think mummies are brilliant, and this is a fantastic story, but I'm afraid it's a story that is being overlaid with folklore and fantasy and fiction and people basically making things up, so it's been very hard to tell what exactly happened. This is the story as I understand it. Firstly, I'll take you back a bit. A bit of geography. If you can see here, I don't know if you can see here, there's an external stair here that leads to a door which is barred by a gate, and that leads into a chamber in the body here. There's also another chamber you can't see here, that's down here, that is just below ground level. So there's two chambers, one above the other in the haunted tower. This is the entrance into the upper chamber. It's very difficult to get in and see it, but basically that there is the edge of the door, and around it is the body of the chamber, and the chamber is just over 10 feet long. And this is the entrance into the lower chamber. When I was there were works going on, so I couldn't actually get inside it, but that's down below ground level. So those are the two chambers. This is what I think of as the timeline for the discovery of the mummies and the dissemination of their story. In late 1867 or early 1868, the Reverend Skinner, who was the vicar of the St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, just down the road here, he was passing the tower, which, like other parts of the cathedral, was undergoing renovations at the time. And one of the masons dropped a chisel, and in fact that seemed to fall into a hole, and they investigated. There seemed to be a gap behind there. The area was all completely blocked up. So the Reverend Skinner encouraged them to investigate further, and they took the stones away, and he went inside, and by candlelight he saw a large wooden coffin with the lid had fallen off it, and inside was a preserved female corpse. Its skin was still there, its hair was still there, it was very long hair. It was wearing a satin dress, which on touch crumbled into dust, and long elbow-length white leather gloves buttoned up. Unfortunately, the Reverend Skinner didn't make any notes at the time, and he was remembering his account for something like 30 years later. But that, I think, is the first time that the mummies were actually discovered. The workmen built up the chamber, and it was supposedly forgotten about. But you can imagine that something like this gets around pretty quickly. There are mummies in the tower. It wasn't called the Haunted Tower up to this point. There are mummies in the tower, people would say, and soon stories got around. And then on 7th of September 1868, a pair of local antiquarians, Mr. Smith, who was a jeweller, Mr. Walker, who was the university librarian, decided that they wanted to investigate further. So they persuaded the man who was in charge of the cathedral cleanup and a mason and his teenage apprentice to reopen the chamber. So they assembled before 6 o'clock in the morning, because they did not want to disturb the public with bodies turning up. And they took down the stones and they went inside. For about an hour, they were inside. None of them left any notes of sketches like that of the time. And they were interviewed 25 years later. And it's their memories that we're now dependent upon. One of them said they saw 6 mummies. One of them said they saw 10 mummies. But bearing in mind that this place is only 10 feet long, which is about from me to the second row there, it must have been absolutely crammed with coffins and bodies. And they said that the bodies were so stiff that they could take them out of the coffins and prop them against the walls. And they must have done that so they could get further into the chamber. And can you imagine what it must have been like? They're exploring by candlelight in this otherwise unlit chamber. It's tiny. There's 4 of them, 4 humans, and there are 6 to 10 corpses in coffins all around. Both of them identified the female corpse with the long hair, the preserved skin, and the gloves. At one point, one of the people there took one of the gloves as a souvenir, or part of one of the gloves, and we know that because it turned up about 25, 30 years later. What's happened to it now, we have no idea. But that's the great investigation. 7th of September 1868, and by 7 a.m. they're closing it up again because they didn't want to disturb the public, and they all swore that they would not reveal what they had seen to anyone. You can imagine how that went. By the 1870s, St. Andrews was rife with rumours of what was in that tower. Apparently there was the preserved body of a female saint. That was one story. Another story said there were a group of women in riding costumes sitting in their coffins praying. Another one said that they were grouped around in a feast, as if at a table, just a table of corpses. And those are the kind of stories that would be in circulation. And they came to the ear of a chap called W.T. Linskill, who was very active on the local council. And Mr. Linskill was a very active ghost hunter, very romantic ghost hunter. He wanted more than anything to see a ghost. He never achieved his desire, but he spent his lifetime investigating these kind of things. So Mr. Linskill, I missed out something here. I'll get on to Mr. Linskill decided to investigate again. So almost 20 years to the day of the first investigation, he persuaded the teenage mason from this investigation, who is now a master mason, to open up again the chamber in what was now called the Haunted Tower. Mr. Linskill had a flair for the dramatic, so he decided to open up things at midnight, because that's a good time to open up and find mummies. So they went in there, once again, with candlelight. He doesn't say how many people were with him. He just says friends were with him. So let's say Mr. Linskill, the mason, and 2 other people were there, going in by candlelight, and they expect to find the female corpse and the coffins and the other mummies. What they find instead are just destruction. They find shards of coffins, they find bones, they find scattered skulls. It's complete destruction, and they find bits of hay, as if someone has been packing up corpses. Clearly, sometime between 1868 and 1888, someone had broken into the chamber and taken all the mummies away. They packed them up in boxes and taken them up away. Who had done that? Nobody knew then, nobody knows now. The finger was pointed at the student body, but nobody came forward, nobody really knew what had happened. Then in 1894, an anonymous correspondent, wrote to a local newspaper describing a conversation that he said he'd had with the local skipper. According to him, the skipper had been hired by a group of medical students to break into this chamber and steal the corpses. And he had, in particular, they wanted the preserved female corpse with the long hair. And he had taken that corpse and hidden it in a cellar for these medical students. But then a rival antiquarian got wind of it and had bribed him a much bigger sum, and he'd sold the body to this antiquarian, and then it had disappeared. Nobody knows whether that story is true or whether it was something that was just made up by the anonymous correspondent. But we do know that all those mummies just completely disappeared. One of the curiosities of this entire investigation is that it's full of contradictions. According to Smith and Walker, there were 5 people present on that day, on that early morning in 1868. 2 masons, the man in charge of the clear-up, and these 2 antiquarians. But many years later, Professor Heddle, who was a professor of chemistry at the university, briefly mentioned that he'd been there on the day as well. He'd popped his head into the upper chamber, seen some of the bodies, and then he had gone and recovered a whole bunch of skulls from the lower chamber. And this is the only time that anyone has ever mentioned that there were human remains in the lower chamber. I have no idea whether this is not true. He took the skulls away. He said they were in very good condition, and many of them were held together. The cranium and the jawbone was held together by a kind of silk bandana. Now, I don't know about you, but I want to know what happened to these skulls. Unfortunately, nobody knows them. They've just vanished, like everything else to do with the mummies and the haunted chamber. They've completely vanished. They may be in a dusty drawer in the university somewhere, completely unrecognised. No, nobody knows. So that's how it was left in 1888, and the chambers that had been opened up were then blocked off with the bars. The few remaining bones and coffin shards that were left behind have disappeared as well. Once again, we have no idea what happened to them. Maybe they were just chucked out as rubbish. We just don't know, because nobody kept any notes, nobody made any reports, nobody made any sketches. A whole bunch of antiquarians with lots of curiosity and absolutely no follow-up. Then, in 1894, 6 years after the final investigation, something was published in the Saturday Review, which is a very popular paper, particularly with the growing middle classes. And it had an absolutely incredible story, literally incredible, in as it was unbelievable. They'd taken the story of the investigation in 1868 and then, in pure journalistic fashion, exaggerated it beyond compare. According to the Saturday Review, when this happened in 1868, a hole was made and one of the antiquarians put his head through, and then his friends saw that his feet became rigid because he had fainted, and they had to pull him out of the hole. And then the next antiquarian went through, and he too was overcome by fear, and he too was faint, had to be pulled out. And finally, a professor of the university made his way into the hole. Nobody could see what was happening, and he came out, and in his arms was a beautiful female corpse, and she looked as if she just died an hour ago. Crikey, it's pretty dramatic stuff, isn't it? You know, it's, we've got black holes, we've got fainting antiquarians, we've got heroic academics, we've got beautiful female corpses. It's Indiana Jones and the secret chamber of mummified babes, isn't it? And it was all complete pants. But what happened, it didn't make the haunted tower famous. Suddenly, it moved from the cosy little world of St. Andrew's ghost hunters and antiquarians, and they'd largely managed to keep it out of the press up until now, and suddenly it was everywhere. And as a result, Linskill was forced into print, and later on he wrote this pamphlet, St. Andrew's Haunted Tower, which is still probably the only solid source that we have for much of what I've talked about today. Later, he also wrote this book, St. Andrew's Ghost Stories, still in print, still very popular. You can see how old my copy is. These are both my copies. You can see how old my copy is. Has anyone read Linskill, by the way? Has anyone read this book? Yeah? Okay. I don't want to speak ill of writers, but it's 80% pants, I'm afraid. It's 80% fiction. The 20% that's not fiction is actually quite useful, but most of it is, I'm afraid, highly coloured Gothic romance. But this pamphlet here is very useful indeed. So, now, let's get... I was going to give you a warning here to say, just in case, if anyone's squeamish about dead bodies, please look away, but I got it too late. The mummies that we have no descriptions of whatsoever, there may have been 6 of them, may have been 10 that were in the haunted chamber, I think probably looked something like this. These are mummies that are in the crypt of St. Michan's Church in Dublin, and they have preserved skin, nails, hair, ears, It's truly extraordinary. I've been in there. I've actually touched a mummy. It's a truly memorable event. And I think they were probably something like this. And now they've all completely vanished. And because of the mummies and the discoveries and the sensational stories that were sent around there, somehow the White Lady got intertwined with the Lady of the Tower, the female corpse with the long hair and the kid gloves. Somehow she became that ghost. And you can see why, even though prior to that there was absolutely no connection whatsoever. So we have to ask, who was the Lady of the Tower? Who was this female corpse that everyone goes on about? Well, on the tower itself, there's a very hard to decipher inscription to Catherine Clephane, who was a well-connected, wealthy local individual, and she died sometimes before 1608. So you think it might be her, but Catherine Clephane was about 60 when she died, and all the reports describe the female corpse as being young, so it's probably not her. But Catherine did have two daughters, one of them named Christiane, and the other one whose name is missing from the only manuscript that relates to it, so we don't know her name. They both died in 1605 from the plague. So we can imagine a possibility that the Clephane family, who were, like I said, well off, they were well connected, they'd somehow managed to get around the plague laws. The plague laws said that anyone who died of plague had to be buried in the mass graves that were on the scores. Perhaps they were so powerful, so influential, that they managed to avoid this. They managed to put their plague dead into this chamber, and then they blocked it up. That's one possibility. But we don't know when this chamber was used or opened. We don't know when it was closed. So the corpses could have been there long before 1605, or they could have been there after 1605. So we have absolutely no idea, in the end, about the identity of this female corpse. I suspect it might actually be one of these daughters who were described as probably around about 18-year-old, 20-year-old, but I can't say for certain. And now all the evidence has vanished and we can't tell anything at all. But we do have an intriguing possibility about the White Lady. Possibly the foot of the White Lady still exists. In the 1890s, two visitors to the Museum of the Philosophical Society mentioned that there was a foot of a preserved female corpse in the museum, and both of them thought that it was the foot of the White Lady, not the White Lady, excuse me, the Lady of the Tower, the mummy in the tower, and they thought that might have been the only thing that remnant. But nobody knew how this foot had got to the museum at all. There was no provenance whatsoever. And I went in search of this foot. I thought, well, if it was there in 1894, perhaps it's still around. And lo and behold, it is. It's in the university teaching collection. It is used in teaching anatomy of the foot. Unfortunately, I can't show you a photograph of it because there are now restrictions about showing human remains. But there is a foot about that big, and it has preserved skin on it, and it's female, and it is used to teach the anatomy of the foot. Is it the foot of the mummy in the tower? Well, possibly, but then again, possibly not, because up until the 19th century, the college museum also had a mummy, a real Egyptian mummy. This is not it. This is a Egyptian mummy, an Egyptian mummy. But they had a mummy in their collection, and unfortunately, they didn't take very good care of their exhibits, and the mummy decayed and fell apart. By some time in the 1880s, it had already fallen apart. So there's a good chance that the foot that is used for teaching students about anatomy is actually the Egyptian mummy, female Egyptian mummy. The bells! The bells! Should have come in a really dramatic, I should have paused really dramatically then, shouldn't I? Yeah. It's maybe the foot of their Egyptian mummy, or maybe it's the foot of the Lady of the Tower. We have no idea, and there are no hauntings associated with this foot in the teaching collection. Moving on to something completely different, away from apparitions, into poltergeists. This is Pitmilly House, which used to stand near King's Barnes, about 8 miles south of here. It was demolished in the late 1960s, and as far as I can tell, there's not even a stone left, which is a bit of a shame because it was the site of one of the most extraordinary poltergeist outbreaks of the 20th century. As far as I can tell, it starts around about 1936. At the time, the house is owned by the Fisher family, quite a well-off family, and they are seated around the table at dinner, and a burning coal appears in the middle of the dinner service, in the pail. It sets fire there. And that is the first of hundreds of events that plague the family for the next 4 years. Burning coals appear in different parts of the house. Small fires break out. Tiny fires under the beds, in bathrooms, on enamel tiles. A woman's hat in a cupboard goes on fire. Blinds go on fire. Towels are set on fire. Sometimes the fire leaves scorch marks. Sometimes it leaves no mark at all. On one occasion, someone tries to pat out the fire, and the fire moves around his hand to avoid being put out. Ewers of water left in the bedrooms. As soon as someone leaves, the water is dumped over the beds. Beds move up and down, sometimes with people in them. Bedclothes are taken off. Very heavy furniture, the kind of furniture that takes 2 people to move, moves fast across the floor. Brass urns, ashtrays and other ornaments fly through the air, sometimes doing a 90-degree turn, which is quite unusual. Pictures on the walls are taken off and stacked in piles, or have turned to the wall, or are taken off the wall onto the floor, or put back onto the wall. Chairs and other objects fall from the upper floors and attack people as they're coming up and down the stairs. All these kind of things go on for years. The family are absolutely plagued by it. This poltergeist outbreak, I think, has 3 phases. The first phase comes to a climax in early part of 1940. When 17 separate fires break out. There's quite a lot of damage to the house. The fire brigade are called. An elderly servant has to be rescued from an upstairs room, and somehow something seems to pass, something seems to click, and the phenomenon seems to calm down at this point. But then something changes at this point. After the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, large numbers of Poles came to Britain to fight in the war. Many of them were based in this part of Fife. This mosaic was created by 3 of the Polish soldiers. It's there on the town hall. To commemorate the welcome that the Poles received from the people of St Andrews and Fife. A number of the Poles were stationed in and around Pitmilly House. Now the Fisher family were still living there, but there were the contingents of military around the area as well. And one of them was this chap, Jan Rostowski. He was 22 years old. He was a poet. He was a corporal in the 1st Polish Rifle Regiment, and he fell in love with the 17-year-old daughter of the Fisher family. So he was spending a lot of time at the house, more than his military duties. And as I said, up to this point, the poltergeist phenomenon seemed to have calmed down for a few months. But he remembers things getting truly strange when he was there. The first thing that happened is they came into his room and all his clothes were spread over the floor. And he thought that his girlfriend, Mary, was angry with him. So he confronted her and said, "Why did you throw my clothes on the floor?" She said, "No, that's not me who did it." And then he was introduced, initiated into the world of the poltergeist, and became its target quite a lot. The usual thing, fires, water, objects being thrown, that kind of thing. The worst thing that happened to him is that he was reading in bed, and a wardrobe, one of these really heavy antique wardrobes that was on the other side of the bedroom, moved across the floor towards him in bed and stood at the end of the bed and teetered over him like this, as if it was menacing him. And he got out of bed and he skedaddled quite quickly. And the following morning, they went back inside. The wardrobe was next to the bed, and it took 4 people to move it back to the wall. Not surprisingly, under that kind of strain, his relationship with 17-year-old Mary didn't last. I think they may have actually been engaged briefly, but the relationship didn't last. Unfortunately, Jan didn't write anything down about his experiences, but he did relay them to his family, and it's his family, his daughter and his nephew, who told me about all the stories that he experienced. And the stories about, you know, bayonets being stuck in the wall and all these sort of things. And that was Pitmilly during the Second World War. And then it changed again. After the war, it became a hotel. In 1947, it was sold and became a hotel. So the Fisher family moved out. The hotel period is very poorly documented in terms of phenomena. We don't really have any strong dates. I know that sometime in the 1950s, one of the guests came out of his room to find a line of fire running across the wall of the corridor. And when he went up to follow it, there was no scorch marks on it, and he immediately packed his bags and headed for Rusacks Hotel in St Andrews and told everyone about it. And there were other examples of people saying that strange things happened, but it's not, as I say, it's not very well documented, partly because the hotel went down market and it ended up being a sort of basically a base for people having holidays in static caravans, so there was no central place where people could go and report these occasions. And then in 1968, 68, the place was demolished and nothing exists of it at all. The story, the poltergeist outbreak was never investigated by anyone competent at all. No psychical investigator, no member of the Ghost Club, no one went and studied this. It was absolutely extraordinary, the most extreme outbreak of poltergeist phenomena, not the most extreme, but certainly one of the most extreme, and nobody really studied it. So what we have, these sort of bits and pieces. It did, however, have an afterlife. It was turned into a play, The Poltergeist, by Frank Harvey, who was a correspondent of one of the people who was interested in the story. And it had a nice West End run, and it took a lot of the episodes from Pitmilly and it transferred them to a vicarage in Dartmoor, and it turned it into a comedy. And then it was turned into a film, Things Happen at Night, which is basically the play being filmed. And boy, does it look like a play being filmed. It's really creaky and it's a bit dull, to be honest. And supposedly it's a comedy. I didn't crack a smile once. But, you know, things have changed in 50 years, you know. So that was made in 1948. So that was the afterlife of the Pitmilly poltergeist. And I think it's a great shame that we are no longer able to investigate this further, because there is basically, unless more witnesses come forward, we don't have anything more to find out. This is a local newspaper. The Mystery House is coming down. This is describing when it was being demolished. I draw your attention to an intriguing paragraph. Famous in psychic history as the only house for which an insurance company paid compensation for a fire believed to have been caused by a ghost. That's true. At the fire of 1940, an insurance claim was made for £800. The insurance company investigated. They decided to pay £400. Their report apparently said that the fire was not caused by human agency, it was not caused by accident, it was not caused by an act of God, and therefore it was caused by the poltergeist. So the insurance company recognised the reality of this poltergeist. And for a long time, I thought this was the only case where an insurance company actually paid out on that. But I found another case. This is from 1952. This is a house in Sussex that had similar phenomena taking place over a number of months. A fire took place, an insurance claim was made, and it was paid out, although it says here the sum paid is a secret, so we never learned how much money the insurance company paid out there. So we know there are two examples here. I tend to think that a culturally conservative organisation such as an insurance company is not going to be filled with a sort of flim-flam and nonsense. So I think that the things that happened at Pitmilly House really did happen. What caused them is another question. The conventional wisdom has grown up about poltergeist cases, is that a study of them has shown is that the majority of them have what's called a focus, a focal person around whom the phenomena cluster. And the majority of these focal people are female and below the age of 21. And the idea has grown up is that somehow the poltergeist is not an external spirit, but is an external manifestation of the inner turmoil of the young woman in the household. Maybe she's going through puberty, or maybe there's stresses in the family, relationship problems, that sort of thing. So that has become the sort of like the standard view. It doesn't apply everywhere, but it's the standard view. In the case of Pitmilly, we have a candidate. Mary was 17 years old. She'd had a very troubled childhood because she was not allowed to go to school. She's not allowed to leave the house to go to school. She was brought up in the house by her domineering mother. When the poltergeists event started, she was 11 years old, presumably just entering puberty, which is the perfect time, a classic time when poltergeist phenomena are exhibited by girls of that age. So in theory you think, well, maybe Mary is the focus. But that's not always, doesn't seem to be the case. Firstly, Jan, her short-term boyfriend, he was convinced that the poltergeist was actually caused by Captain Geoffrey, the head of the household, Mary's father, and that he was convinced he was doing this because he hated Jan. That is, that Jan was a foreigner who was courting the young 17-year-old Mary, and he was convinced that the Mary's father hated him so much that he was actually causing the poltergeist phenomena himself. Now that, I suspect, is an expression of the tension that existed between the two men. You know, the good-looking young foreigner and the 50-year-old conservative Captain Geoffrey is the father, protective father of his daughter. That's as far as it goes. That was his belief at the time, but that's as far as it goes. But I don't think Mary was the focus, because she left the house in 1947, and the phenomena, as far as we can tell, continued up until the 1960s. So there goes that theory. And as with most things when it comes to ghosts and hauntings, I have absolutely no idea what was going on at Pitmilly. Let's move on to some other more local poltergeists. This is Rusak's Hotel. Some of you will know it. This is from 1958. Night scare for 3 young men. Objects jump across bedroom. Is there a poltergeist in a St Andrew's house? Maybe. The 3 chaps were musicians. They were in the house band of the hotel. They were coming to the end of their summer engagement. It was 1958. They were the Ian Dunn Trio. 1958, they were probably not playing rock and roll in St Andrew's Hotel, I'm willing to bet. Anyway, they'd gone to bed, just turned out the light, there's a thump, turned the lights back on, and a salt cellar and a book had flown across the room and hit the opposite wall. And they knew they could see the route. Bit surprised, bit scared, turned the light back off again, another thump. In this case, a leather belt had flown across the room. By now, they're really frightened. They keep the lights on. At 3 o'clock, they go down and tell the under-manager, there's a ghost in our room. And, you know, yeah, right, kids, yeah. But they say, yeah, really, there's a ghost in our room. Makes the papers. The following night, similar thing happens around about midnight. They turn the light off. Bang, turn the light back on. A salt cellar has flown across the room. Turn the lights off. Bang, turn the lights back on. An inkwell has flown across the room. Something similar happens on the 3rd night. After that, they leave, their engagement is finished, they all return to their homes, and there are no more phenomena no more phenomena associated with that place or time. That's it. It's a completely discrete event, completely unlike Pitmilly. But what's this? Kirkcaldy Ghost again, on the same page. Well, this is where it gets truly strange, because on the same night, there was a poltergeist outbreak in Kirkcaldy, 23 miles away. So at the same time, the same night, poltergeists are active in these 2 places. This is a completely different one. This is similar in a way to Pitmilly. It takes place not in a mansion, but in a council house. This particular council house in Kirkcaldy, council house ghost terrifies 5 family. For 7 months, the family had been experiencing noises, bangs, crashes, the movement of furniture, drawers coming out of the chest of drawers, and generally they were frightened as anything. They invited a neighbour to stay the night, a man they didn't know very well, and was a self-confessed skeptic. He said, I don't believe in ghosts, they're a load of nonsense. At 4 a.m, he leaves the house with 3 of the children because he can't stand it anymore, he's so scared by the noises. That night, the rest of the children, there are 9 children in the house. Mother, father, and 9 children. They all leave the house. They're all scattered around friends and relatives. They refuse to sleep in the house. The mother is put on to sedatives. The father is spending all his nights awake looking for the ghost, and he's unable to go to work. Their family life is collapsing. They invite the local MP to spend the night to investigate, Tom Hubbard. Tom Hubbard goes along fully sympathetic, speaks to the journalist next day. It's a load of nonsense, he says. There is no ghost. These people are making it up. He also gets the local councillor and the factor of the council housing to stay the night as well. They don't report any phenomena either. Psychics turn up, as they usually do in this kind of thing. One of them says they saw an apparition of a 11-year-old boy in the house. The family had lost a child when he was very young. If he'd still been alive, he would have been 11 years old now. So, ooh, spooky, creepy. Everyone thought, well, it's the ghost of the dead child that's doing this. This is the father. Things got worse. Went on for weeks. Things got worse. The children were so tired because they weren't sleeping at night. They weren't going to school, and the parents kept them away from school. They refused to pay their rent because they wanted a new council house because they were so scared of the ghosts. The education authorities sent them letters saying we will prosecute you unless you send your kids to school. The council sent them letters saying we will sue you if you don't pay your rent. Their life is truly collapsing. It's really getting really worse and worse and worse. And then finally they get moved. They get moved to another house, and he pays his arrears. He goes back to work. The kids go back to school. Finally, it seems to calm down. The new tenants move into the haunted house. Now, of course, the journalists are interested in what their experiences are, so they're banging on the door straight away. And the new tenants say the ghost was caused by a banging cistern. And I don't know really what was going on here. No one really knows. Something like for 7 months they were plagued by these noises. There's a strong suspicion of hoax going here. It is possible that the hoax was perpetuated by an aggrieved neighbour, because, and let's go back a bit. It's hard to see here, but this is a close, an open close. So that was the route into the garden behind, and one of the bedrooms was here, and it's possible to be in that close and bang on the ceiling, and the council workers found marks on the ceiling as if someone had been banging with a broom. So it's possible that we have some kind of neighbourhood dispute, and that someone is going in there and banging at night with a broom to disturb the family. Although to do that for 7 months is a pretty much heroic state of nuisance. There were 9 children. It's possible that the hoax were perpetuated by more than one of the children. Perhaps they were climbing out of the windows and they were banging on there. The new tenants certainly thought there was no haunting whatsoever. One of their neighbours did think there was. The MP, the councillor and the factor didn't think that there wasn't. The sidekicks thought there was. Nobody really knows. Nobody really knows. But what was the case is that this family truly believed that they were haunted. So much so that their life was in tatters by the end of it. So if it wasn't real, the result was the same. It doesn't matter whether there was a poltergeist or there wasn't a poltergeist. As far as they're concerned, it was, and it almost destroyed their lives. Fortunately, they moved out, and things seem to have calmed down after that. Moving on from poltergeists to something, I think, even stranger. This is Dunino Church. Anyone know Dunino Church? Yeah, excellent. Yep, it's a great place. Really strange set of mysteries around this area. I'm not going to go into them there. At some point in the 19th century, possibly the early 20th century, because we don't have a date, a traveller was passing through Fife on horseback, and he paused to look at Dunino Church, and he went and looked at the view just to the north, and he saw there on the plain below him what he described as the perfect old world Fife village. A little group of whitewashed houses, a smithy, men and women in old-fashioned clothing, spinning, standing there talking, bathed in sunlight, kale yards, flowers. He thought it was the most perfect place imaginable. He drank it in, got on his horse, went off to St Andrews. A year later, is on the same route with a companion. And he said, you must come and see this village. It's an absolutely wonderful place. It's brilliant. So he took them to the same viewpoint, and they looked out, and there was no village there at all. Not a sign of a village. There had never been a village there. And of course, he was perplexed by this. Back in the 1980s, a local writer named Helen Cook investigated this story, and she looked at the maps and sort of accounts of the period. This is Dunino Church here. It's on a slight mound, and he was looking to this direction here, and that's where he saw the village. Unfortunately, none of the maps or the older documents can tell us whether or not there was a village or not. There may possibly have been a village, but we can't say that there definitely was. Because if there had been a village, what he might have experienced was some kind of time slip. And I've encountered a number of these kind of stories. This is where someone goes to a certain place and they somehow seem to move into the past. They somehow seem to experience the past. The most famous case took place in the gardens of Versailles, where two English ladies seemed to walk into the France of Marie Antoinette. They saw the 18th century French courtiers, and the French courtiers saw them, and then they came out and thought, was that a costume party? And that may have happened here. Maybe this was a time slip. But if it wasn't a real, if there had never been a village there, then what had he experienced? Was it a vision of a village somewhere else in Scotland that had somehow been transported here? Or was it possibly that it was an entirely subjective experience? Reading what he wrote, it seems that the village was bathed in sunlight, and it was silent, and it was still. Even though there were lots of people in there, it was still. It's possible he was actually in a mild trance. He was in an altered state. And in that altered state, he saw the village. He saw his ideal village, as it were. But he didn't actually experience it directly, which is why when he showed it to a friend, it wasn't there. It's another mystery without an end. In 1934, a jobbing gardener was working in a greenhouse in a St Andrew's house. Not this greenhouse, a greenhouse. And he was quite surprised when his elderly employer tapped on the greenhouse window and beckoned him. And he was surprised because his employer was by and large housebound, he had very limited mobility, so he couldn't understand what he was doing in the garden. So he came out of the greenhouse and into the garden to look for the old man, who wasn't there. The old man's daughter was there, and he said, "Where's your father?" And he said, "He's not here, he's in the house." So they both went into the house, and the old man was there in the house asleep, and he clearly hadn't moved for about 4 hours. But the gardener had seen him, plain as day, tapping on the window and beckoning him. Now, this kind of phenomenon, this kind of experience is sometimes called, seen a wraith or a fetch, that is to say a phantasm or phantom of someone who's actually alive at the time. So it's not the ghost of the dead, it's a ghost of the living, if you like. And there are quite a number of examples of this. Now, the gardener gave the conventional interpretation of this, which was that to see the fetch, to see the wraith, was a sign of death. He said the old man is going to die. And usually he said the old man is going to die in 4 days' time. Now, I've read hundreds of accounts of death omens and fetches and wraiths and doppelgangers. I've never encountered anyone saying specifically it means that he's going to die in 4 days' time. He did die in 4 days' time, which is curious. We have other wraiths, other fetches from St Andrews. In the 17th century, Archbishop Sharp, his wraith was seen in the area which is now St Leonard's School by 2 people, whilst Sharp was alive and well in Edinburgh at the time. In the same nest of buildings, 2 servants saw the fetches of a coach driver and the coach driver's postilion. Postilion is the chap who was at the back of the coach while the coach driver's doing the horses. I don't think in this case the postilion had been struck by lightning. And they saw the coachman and the postilion in the chamber, and they both recognised them. And the postilion and the coachman were alive and well in the stables just a few yards away. And when they checked, they were actually asleep. But in the room, these 2 wraiths were seen and then they vanished. And then, once again, in the same cluster of buildings, if I can get this is St Leonard's School. They're in the same cluster of buildings here. We're talking about buildings that don't exist anymore, sadly. David Brewster, Sir David Brewster, who was then the principal of United College, was living in one of these buildings, and he saw the wraith of one of his friends, the Reverend Lyon. So we have 3 examples in the same cluster of buildings over 200 years of people seeing the wraiths of the living. Does that mean anything? I have absolutely no idea. But I'll finish with another story related to St Leonard's. Has anyone heard of or read this lady, Mary Butts? And not familiar to anyone? No? She was a minor novelist of the modernist period of the 1920s. She hung around with the bohemians of Paris. She knew Jean Cocteau. She met Arthur Crowley. She wrote poetry and modernist fiction. She experimented with drugs and relationships and sexuality. She was very much of that period. And in her autobiography, she has a very interesting story. She was sent to St Leonard's School for Girls, sent away from her beloved Dorset because she didn't get on with her stepmother. Stepmother and her hated each other, so she was sent to St Leonard's, and she was deeply, deeply unhappy. And when she was 16, 1906, she's at the very end of her term. She's looking forward to finishing, and she goes for a walk on the south coast of St Andrews, and she's passing a cove. She doesn't say which cove it was. It might have been this cove. We're not sure. And she was crossing the cove, and this is what happened to her. The sun blazed palely above, but on the dry sand I had walked into a pool, an air pool. It was grey and whirling, as if full of specks, yet under the unclouded sun it was as if out of it. In dead, spinning cold I turned, not faint but blind. With an immense effort I wrenched myself out of it, tore on and sank to a rock on the further side. What had I struck? It looked all right, or perhaps it was as if a patch of air in the mid-beach had gone dead. Later on she uses words like this about it: inimical, deadly, a focus of evil, a column of energy, cold and vile and hateful. She never knew what she'd encountered. It's quite possible that it was psychological, that it was an internal subjective experience, in which case it's completely one-off and we know nothing further. It's quite possible that she encountered something in the environment. There's some kind of recording in the environment and she stepped into it and somehow activated it. Or it's quite possible that she did indeed enter into some, what she called a vortex of evil. And it actually had a genuine, real, authentic existence. What of those options are the case? I have absolutely no idea, and that's what I would leave you with. When it comes to hauntings and supernatural phenomena, I have absolutely no idea. Thank you very much. I'm more than happy to take questions, and if you're lucky, you might actually get a coherent answer. Anyone want to start off? Or I bamboozled you into silence.
Can I ask something, Geoff?
Yeah.
Have you experienced any paranormal happenings?
It's good. That's a good question. Have I experienced any paranormal happenings? Well, can I tell you an anecdote? I'm a member of the Ghost Club, which is the oldest psychical investigation group in the world, and they really know how to run an investigation. I've been an observer on other investigations run by people who I trust about as far as I could throw a piano. But in this case, these people really know what they're doing. And I don't go on many because I find them very boring. You turn up late at night and you spend several hours and nothing happens, because when I'm there, nothing happens. And it's now become a kind of joke that if I'm there, the other ones will go, well, nothing's going to happen because he's there. Because I seem to somehow have this aura. I seem to cast a field, a null field, where nothing supernatural will happen. The only time when appears to be the case was on the ship Discovery in Dundee. And we were doing an all-night investigation there. Now, Discovery is allegedly haunted. The reports of hauntings on Discovery go back to the 1980s. And has anyone been on Discovery? Yep. Okay. You know what it's like. It's quite cramped inside. Yeah. It's low ceilings and it's very difficult to get around. And a bunch of us were in the wardroom, which is sort of like the only room with enough space. There's a table, and we all heard some very loud footsteps on the deck above. Now this was significant because footsteps are the most persistently recorded phenomenon on Discovery. So we all went, footsteps, footsteps. Now, because it's a very well organised investigation, they had cameras on different parts of the ship. And they had observers in different parts. So everyone was soon right on the walkie-talkie trying to establish whether or not there'd been anyone on the deck at the time. Because if they had been on the deck, obviously it was just a normal phenomenon, nothing to do with ghosts. Unfortunately, there was no camera pointing out that area at the time. So the conclusion that we come to is that those footsteps are unknown. It is quite possible that one of the team or one of the assistants from Discovery was on the deck at the time and was either larking around or was too embarrassed to actually admit that they'd been walking across the deck. So that might have been supernatural or it might not have been. Other than that, I spend my working life hanging around stone circles and caves and haunted castles and haunted theatres and other haunted buildings and other places where, magic and witchcraft and all these things have happened, and I've not once had a supernatural experience. Boy, am I boring. Anyone else? Yes?
Why were you referred to as the ghouls and goblins?
Because I'd already written a couple of books by this point, and I was starting to generate a small number of talks locally when I was talking about witchcraft or folklore and that sort of thing. So he couldn't think of my name, so it just came to his head, the Ghouls and Goblins guy. Yeah. Does that? Yeah. Anyone else?
How did you get started?
How did I get started? How did I get started on investigating the supernatural?
Yeah.
This is a very long story, which I'll condense into a very short bit. It starts when I'm 7 years old, and I'm given a book for Christmas on dinosaurs. How many people were keen on dinosaurs when they were kids? Yeah? Oh, yeah, loads. Okay. What was your favourite dinosaur? Velociraptor, yeah? Same, okay. Young people, Jurassic Park generation, aren't you? Yeah, so older people who was older and liked dinosaurs. What was your favourite dinosaur? Brontosaurus. What was yours? T-Rex. Okay. Well, mine was a Triceratops. The one with the horns. I loved dinosaurs. I knew all their names. I had their models. Fantastic. And they were my portal. They were my window because they introduced me to dragons. And dragons are even cooler than dinosaurs because they can fly, they can breathe fire, and they're smart. And dragons gave me the whole world of mythology and folklore and legend, and that took me into horror fiction and science fiction and fantasy fiction, and that led me eventually into real world weirdness, not just fictional weirdness. That's the short part. Then part 2 comes many years later, and I am hitchhiking down the M5. And I'm heading home to Cardiff. I'm going down the M5, and I'm picked up by this middle-aged couple. And in the back of their car, it's filled with books. I thought, that's interesting. You don't see that often. That's what I chuck with books. So and said, oh, we've just been to a book sale. And we're buying lots of books. Are you dealers? No. He's an author, right? Okay. So that's interesting. So I'm talking to the chap, and he knows about everything. He knows about witchcraft and the supernatural. He knows about crime and murder. He knows about history and philosophy and literature and sociology. And he knows about everything. And I said, who are you? And he said, oh, my name's Colin Wilson. Does that name ring a bell? Does that ring a bell with anyone? No? Okay. Colin Wilson has written more than 70 books on the supernatural. He is the grandfather these days of British supernatural non-fiction. He's like a god in my world. And he was so fascinating that I went more than 100 miles out of my way to stay in the car and listen to him. And eventually I said, well, I think we've arrived in Devon now. I have to get out because I need to go back north to Cardiff. And when I went home, I went and got his books, and I thought that I found my brand. That's what I want. This is what I want to do. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else?
You said that the house you mentioned was a bad case of poltergeist activity. What's the worst you've heard of or documented?
The worst I've heard of is documented in a book called The South Shields Poltergeist, which is a series of events that took place in the early 2000s in the northeast of England. And it's written by two people who were investigators who were present for pretty much the entire realm. And I've spoken to one of them, and he said he genuinely felt in fear of his soul. He said this wasn't like, things being thrown around, all the sort of standard poltergeist. This is a man who was a lifelong atheist. He was convinced that there was something demonic about it because the poltergeist seemed to know how to push the family's buttons. It knew what had happened in the family's past, the dark things in the past, bereavement and that sort of thing. And it was communicating via mobile phone, by text message, by messages on the walls, and it was changing its behavior. As the investigators started to do things, it started responding to the investigators by name. And he generally thought that he was actually encountering something demonic. Not necessarily, Mr. Satan, but something that was evil. Just one last point. Whilst you've been watching this presentation, you may not be aware of it, but there have been a number of subliminal messages have been beamed out at you. So in the back of your mind, there is actually a very hard to ignore sort of itch in the back of your mind. It's saying, buy Geoff's books, buy Geoff's books. He will sign them for you if you buy them. So if you hear that voice in the back of your head, don't ignore it. It's a good voice. So anyway, thank you very much indeed.